course, has examined the company and figured out what's going on and what its future is and decides to put money into it, that outside source has decided that is a financially sustainable company. Now, this panel is not always about necessarily in being investment ready or raising money necessarily. We might touch on that, however. But that's what we mean by sustainable. I'm then going to talk about the two different kinds of findings our report raised. One was about what's going on with companies in Canada themselves, and the second area is the system in which these companies operate, and then I'm going to summarize some recommendations. So what's going on with companies? And here I'm only focusing on like things that maybe need some attention rather than all of the good news about companies and the environment here in Canada. So what we found is that the very strong entrepreneurial spirit here in Canada among production companies, this is film and TV, but because the funding structures are so complex, there was a heavy focus we found with these entrepreneurs on project financing and structuring rather than thinking about company growth. There are, of course, many notable exceptions to this, but by and large, the business models of many production companies was focused on generating short-term revenues from production fees and production overheads, rather than focusing more on the downstream revenues to be gained by successful content being distributed around the world. Another thing we noticed was this is actually, in terms of sheer numbers of companies, a very large sector. We figured that there's nearly 1,000 companies in Canada that call themselves production companies. Now, and these are probably companies that have all raised money from public sector and trade bodies, trade buyers or what have you. But lots of them are very, very, very small. And in fact, we did a bit of an analysis of how many of these up to 1,000 companies met or were nearly at our definition of sustainability. And we found that of those thousands, less than 10% of the companies actually met that definition or were close to it, which was interesting because we've done similar work in Australia where the equivalent percentage is 45%. Now, Australia has very, very, very far fewer companies and also is a country of a third less people. But even so, that was a remarkable fact. It's very, very substantial and obvious talent and capability and capacity in the sector, but there were some skills gaps among production companies, and those were mostly focused on corporate finance capabilities, strategic development skills, and international market knowledge. Now, of course, this is a big general statement and doesn't apply to every company, but for those 90% of companies that aren't close to sustainability, this is what we found. And additionally, I'm sure this is talked about a lot, we found that producers' ability to fully exploit the IP that they create was restricted under the current system, and the consequence of all of this is a syndrome which we call surviving rather than thriving, and I think you sort of know what that means. Now, looking at the system, the systemic analysis that we did, very, very substantial and impressive amounts of public support, but it seems to have grown around the country in a little bit of an unconnected fashion. It might be quite difficult to navigate for some companies. There may be some unintended consequences of bits of money that don't quite fit together. And what doesn't seem to be in existence is a holistic, all-of-sector strategy for the nation, for the growth of the industry, for the nation as a whole. We found that several ministers of finance or treasuries were unwilling to accept the broader definition and detail of the benefits, the economic, cultural, and social benefits that the sector, we believe the sector delivers. And that this was a very conservative view of evaluating, what are the results of our support of this sector. Again, these are quite broad statements, and the report goes into very much more detail. Broadcaster consolidation and integration and the consequent dominance of a small number of entities has been restrictive. Limited number of gatekeepers, for example, for CMF support seems to be the case. Television terms of trade, big issue, obviously. Difficult, definitely possibly undermining the ability of producers to fully exploit their IP. I never heard the word grind in 35 years of being in finance, and when somebody first mentioned it to me, I thought I was being propositioned in some way. She never delivered on that, sadly. But certainly, these are complex arrangements. They're rather unusual. They seem to have to make life more complex. I believe, however, which is why the asterisk is there, that there are changes afoot. But when we did our study, this was quite an issue. And because there's a large number of funding sources, particularly public funding sources, this means a low barrier of entry to new players. And this may have encouraged the preponderance of financially dependent super micro production companies. By the way, that is not unique to Canada at all. What may be unique to Canada is the sheer volume and number of such companies. Okay, ripping right along. Couple more of these. Feels like consolidation has produced in some areas a rather narrow domestic market, and there are issues like in film, for example, the disappearance of the DVD market, reduction in pre-sales, piracy. There are quite a few negative factors, and that's making life tricky. In our view, the foreign ownership rules can sometimes inhibit inward investment and consolidation opportunities. I know that's a very complicated topic. And indeed, businesses like this are operating in a very complicated global landscape. It's changing. Digital innovation is very disruptive. And with the limited opportunities for domestic television funding, feature film producers are finding themselves particularly under pressure. Okay, my last slide. So what are we saying maybe could be considered? An overall philosophy, perhaps, which is all about using public funding with a specific purpose to leverage, to bring private finance into the sector. For example, every time some public funding is made available for a project or for a company, maybe there should be an assessment. If we put this money on the table for this production company, what can it do to help that company bring private money into the business? It may be there are limited opportunities for this, but doesn't seem to be much of a factor. Modernizing the business model for producers, terms of trade I've talked about, and also maybe protecting the federal tax credit for producers in a way that's more than it is at the moment, adjusting the grind. This is something that that has worked very, very successfully in Australia, which is a dedicated working capital fund available on a very limited basis for production companies that are maybe almost sustainable, haven't quite got there, where money is made available for them based on exciting strategic plans for growth. But if this fund was introduced here in Canada, we would suggest something that is not suggested in Australia, which is it will be essential for private capital to be part of the picture for a successful applicant for this money. As a consequence of the skills gaps we mentioned earlier, new training and professional development schemes for producers, owner-managers of production companies on issues of strategic company development, and providing the tools and some support to create successful business strategies. Moving on to content, this is a little complicated, but basically trying to encourage funders of all types and producers themselves to forget about the old concepts of distributions, to start to think about getting their content circulated, and whatever the business model, whatever the financial model is of that. Now that's, in an era where we haven't quite figured out what those ultimate models might be, this is tricky, but moving towards that direction. And finally, and this may be a bit blue sky, but we've noticed in Canada, it's a very collaborative, by and large, it's a very collaborative country, and people like to do things, jointly in a collaborative way. And we think it may be time in this industry, in this country, to once more attempt a more substantial meeting of minds to build a holistic industrial strategy for the nation as a whole. Okay, that's all on that particular report, and thank the panel for sitting quietly while we went through that. But I'd like to turn attention to the companies and the businesses that are on the panel with that, perhaps as some background. So now we're going to talk very much about how these businesses themselves became sustainable, built towards sustainability, and in the case of Jane, assisted in that process. Can I just come back to the hashtag for BDC, which is not Bank of Canada, which is at BDC_news. So you have it right now, and you'll be getting lots of messages, I'm sure. But Scott, actually, I'd like to start with you. As a company that I know over the years, you've taken various steps to grow the business. You became sustainable quite some time ago. But looking back over history, what were the key steps that you think you took to achieve the sustainability that we're talking about?
I'll keep it fairly simple. It's a big question, and for 5 minutes I could talk for quite some time on it. But I think we started off with a core business strategy that we want creative excellence, and we wanted to be a content provider, and we wanted to be a trusted supplier to end users. So we thought, okay, how can we do these things and have broadcasters or other end users feel these are people we want to work with? So that's underscored a lot of the strategy that we've had over time. I think we started first, the feast or famine. We decided that we needed to do more than one show at a time. We had to have a very rich, diverse development slate, and so we spent our own money, and tried to diversify the type of products. So we started as a feature company. We morphed into a television MOW, and I'll talk about the phases how we access capital to do those things. Then we got into kids series. Then we, besides production, we got into distribution. So we diversified the revenue streams. And we've always tried to be ahead of the curve, so we bought into a digital company that we owned, Smoke Bomb, 5 years ago, knowing it was the space we had to be in. If I'd heard Michael Wolff earlier, maybe we wouldn't have done that. Désolé. And then we've now opened up a Shift 2 that's a branded agency, so we're creating YouTube content. So we're always trying to look at what's the market gap where we can make a difference and try to get there earlier than some of our competitors.
So this process that you've described, did you have a kind of a way of coming up with these thoughts about expansion or diversification? Did you have regular strategy meetings, or was it more opportunistic?
Oh, drinks.
Right.
It's been a very organic growth.
Right.
We've been very focused on running the business on a cash basis, and we thought, okay, we're as the industry morphs, we've always wanted to be nimble, and you need to be nimble in this business, and things are always changing. Right. So, we brought in some angel investors at day 1, 2. We then, as our strategic plans morphed and we needed more capital, we couldn't go to a traditional banker because we didn't have any assets, we didn't have the balance sheet. So we went to our friends at the Business Development Bank, who were very helpful and gave us some fantastic working capital that helped us out at the early stages.
Well, we'd like to learn some more about that a bit later.
And then as we progressed, we then had a track record, and we spent a lot of time, how do you create a financial track record that investors, banks, funders can look at and say, this is a serious company, transparent, so we did audited statements well before we had to. We're still a privately held company, but we've been doing
Stealing my thunder.
So we did audited statements. We brought outside. We have a board of 6. 4 of them are outside directors.
Okay.
We've gone and done library valuations we've tried to get off balance sheet financing and have a real sense of what the value of the company was. The staffing, as financial means allowed, we would increase the staff, the overhead, the infrastructure, which is always that balance. Yeah. How much do you do? At what stage do you do?
Well, let me hold you for some further thoughts there and move to Stephen. So you're one of the very few publicly traded companies. So you're somewhat restricted on what you can say if we dig incredibly deep, but I know you're very open with the information that you provided to us in our discussion so far. And you've been reasonably acquisitive. Your strategy has included trade acquisitions of other players. And when you're considering an acquisition like that, how do you go about identifying and deciding and valuing the targets?
Well, I think we look at it from a number of different angles. I think the first thing was that we had a strategy about the kind of company we wanted to build. And that, as I said earlier, was a vertically integrated company focused on kids and family entertainment, partly because we thought Canadians in particular have a comparative advantage in that field. So that's the first thing. The other thing, just in terms of how we think about the company, is from the earliest days it was not just a production company but a sales organization. And we viewed that, and this goes to your comment about diversification, we viewed that as an essential ingredient to the company right from the very beginning. And I think every producer out there is really in the business of selling things, but they do get distracted by making them from time to time as well. But in terms of the acquisitions and how we look at things, I think the first thing was, does it fit into our overall plan of acquiring library and getting into businesses that are related to kids and family that we're not already in? And so the strategy and being both on message and getting the right companies has been the first thing. How we seek those out and which ones we actually end up acquiring, it's very hard to plan for that. I mean, acquisitions are always kind of opportunistic. You know, I suppose some people think everything's for sale at some price, but it's not exactly true. And so I think for us, it's been really about making sure that each one of those companies fits the overall company we're trying to shape and build. But the other thing is, based on your definition of sustainability, every one of the companies we've bought has been at some level sustainable. They're already established companies, often with a library or a skill set. And in some cases, some of them have been around for a long time, like Epitome and Ragdoll. And CPLG, which is our licensing arm out of the UK, has been around for 40 years. So, yeah, so in the end, it's a roll-up of a number of different companies and libraries and catalogs, but also skill sets along the way. And so management teams are the other part of the acquisition equation.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to ask you about that. But Michael, so Amaze is a very, very interesting company. You're earlier in life, if you like, than the others, and I know you've got specific thoughts about how you want to balance growth with creativity and your involvement. So, as a producer with your own business, how do you deal with balancing those objectives?
Yeah, well, I mean, for us, it's I think first of all, growth doesn't necessarily mean grow bigger. Taze and I came from the creative side of the business, and we always want to stay connected to the creative side of the business. So, you know, there are great companies that are obviously growing bigger, but our focus has been on that connection to the creativity. So we're trying to find the sweet spot between keeping our overhead low enough that we can handle the, you know, a volume of projects that makes us sustainable in building a library, but at the same time being able to be creatively connected to every project that we do. And so growth really for us is about working with bigger and better talent, bigger and better networks internationally, going after bigger and you know, more and more awards, and then reaching broader and broader audiences, which I know is everyone's goal, but it all comes back to us being able to be close to, so that we're not spending our time I guess, in management or chasing investment, but instead, because we came from such a creative route, we want to stay connected to the creative.
And do you feel that your desire and your determination to stay connected to that creativity, does that inhibit the growth of the company in any way from a financial perspective?
Well, I guess, you know, not if we, you know, if we, to one of your points earlier, that we stay also connected to the value of exploiting the IP internationally, because if we can keep the overhead low enough and have a you know, a large chunk of the value of that IP, then we can.
And if your shows end up being very solid, lengthy, the earners over a long period of time,
then that can support our
Okay. Turning to Jane, you are last but very much not least, because you are a source of finance. That's one of the reasons.
Thank you, Scott, for the plugs.
And you know this industry very well, but you also, you know, work in other, or your company works in other industries too. So when you're considering making an investment or making a loan to a business in this sector, What are the factors that you look for, and how might that be different with another sector that you also deal in?
So when we are looking to make a loan to a company in the sector, we're working in partnership with traditional sources of financing typically. So we're not doing production financing.
Right.
We're working with companies doing working capital financing for growth, perhaps doing working capital or unsecured lending for an acquisition or for a shareholder buyout.
Okay.
In those circumstances, or secured lending for capital acquisition. So
Right.
what our role is versus traditional sources of financing is vastly different. So when we're looking at companies in any space, we're looking at them from a couple different criteria. And I was joking with Scott that he stole my thunder, but it's because I love the way your company's managed. There is management's a huge aspect of it.
Right.
So is there a strategic plan in place? It doesn't have to be a formal, written document, but it really has to be, is there a guiding principle for the company? And around that is really the prudent financial management. So any lender or investor is going to want to have a clear picture of, yes, this is the financial position of a company, that they've done the appropriate due diligence around understanding what's happening in the financial side of their company, that they know where they are and what it's going to take to get to the next level. We want to see shareholder commitment. So that was another thing that Scott said. A lot of times in the early days, you have to bootstrap your growth, meaning you got to keep the cash in the business.
Yeah.
That's essential. Any bank or investor is going to want to see, is there commitment from the shareholder, and that in early days is shareholder investment, in later days it's retained earnings. So
Also known as sweat equity.
Right. And then really understanding what the rationale for your financing is. So that's really important for us at BDC because we are doing unsecured lending. We need to, is this working capital going into place to help grow the company, or is it using to finance losses or shareholder withdrawals? So we really need to know.
But you'll spot that before you make an investment.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
Very quickly. But because we are funding for growth, we really want to understand what the rationale for that
Do you put
is.
equity into companies, or do you bring others alongside you who do that?
Yes and no.
Okay.
In this particular space, we would do what we call quasi-equity or subordinated finance, also known as growth and transition capital. Okay. So that kind of money is really used for acquisition financing or equity withdrawals or shareholder buyouts. So, if Scott decides he wants to retire and to finance his exit, we would come in and do a project like that.
Right. By the way, you've now heard from each panelist, so you may already be thinking of things you want to hear from them. So we will leave time at the end for questions, but do be thinking about what those questions might be. But I'll continue for a while talking to people. Just finally, actually, Jane, when you're considering a working capital loan, what are the terms? I mean, what period of time are you willing to wait to get the money back? What kind of interest charge, or what other kind of charges are involved?
You're going to pin me down to the interest charge? I'm not
Give us a
answering that
range.
question. No. So we're a patient lender. Like I said, we work in partnerships with other financial institutions. So our terms and conditions are really tailor-made to reflect the need of the company. We're happy if the charter bank is happy. So we want to also make sure that we don't infringe on that relationship. So with a working capital type facility, typically we would do that over a 5-year term. We're strictly a term lender. We don't do things on a revolving basis.
Right.
And the great thing about our money is it's patient capital. So we typically postpone principal payments so that we can really see the money at work, doing what it's supposed to be doing, and not constrain the cash flow of the company.
Right. Okay. So a couple of you have talked about managing growth, and Stephen, and indeed all of you. When you're looking at an acquisition, you're not like a venture capitalist, are you, where you acquire a company, but you might also put management into the company and restructure their debt or what have you. Do I get it right that you're buying a team that already knows what they want to do and need some cash to get there? Or?
Well, it really depends. Every acquisition has been different.
Okay.
We've treated each one in a different way. So, for example, when we acquired Cookie Jar, the two companies were very similar in terms of size and management structure and so on. And I think combined the companies were sort of 180 people, and by the time we had integrated that, we were down to sort of 120 people. So
Okay.
there are some instances where it's really, merging the whole thing. And then the opposite is true of Nerdcore, which we acquired in December,
Just recently, yes.
animation studio in Vancouver, and everybody from that entire team came on board. So some of it's really about whether it duplicates things that we're already doing. And I think in our case, it's also about figuring out what we are going to do with those assets that we're acquiring. And I think in terms of the capital markets and what they pay attention to is, us deploying capital to acquire companies or assets and then do something different with them from what was being done before, whether it's reinvigorating old rights, changing the way that we monetize the library, or in the case of, as I say, with Nerdcore, it was really to reorganize the creative side of and production side of our kids and family business, and change that output.
Right. So the trade and strategic elements of the acquisition were just as important as what the finances look like in quite a few cases.
Absolutely, but of course the numbers have to work.
Yeah. Right. I want to talk a bit about the skills needed to manage this kind of growth or this kind of accessing capital. Because one thing we found as a company is that the brilliant producers who are great at making a certain kind of content don't necessarily have the same suite of skills that are needed to build a strong business. Have any of you found that to be the case, or how have you managed the growth?
Well, I think everybody who's built a growing company knows that they need to hire people who do things that are different from what they do. There's other skill sets that you need, and certainly in our company, and I know it's true in your company, trying to make sure that, and especially in our company where we have, in a way, decoupled some of the business of managing the financial side and raising money from the actual business of running the company.
Right. Scott, how
I think as I said, our growth has been organic. We've looked to fill gaps. So, and as we had more wherewithal, we could get better accounting people, which is a department that was really important to us, having a chief financial officer who could do a very high level of diligence. And but it's all, can you afford it? Here's how much the money's coming in. It's a checklist. So when we decided we wanted to be in the digital space, we did a search, and we were going to build it from the ground up. And then we were working with some guys that we thought, okay, maybe it makes more sense to do a joint venture. And so we tried it that way. And when we set up our branded agency, we went to a woman, Karen Whitney, who was exactly what we needed. And then we set up an LA office because we thought, okay, let's get Americans talking to Americans because they don't. And we went out and found some really good development people. So it's really matching the skill set.
So your ability to identify the kind of people who would work well in the culture of your organization was obviously quite an important.
It's very important, the fit. We have it's like a family. It's like we have very long-standing employees, and it's a really good group of people. No, and another thing I touched on before is we have a very proactive board of directors with 4 outside directors that bring in 2 investment banker types, an ex-broadcast exec. So we talk to our board a lot and get strategic advice and direction and run things by them, and they say, what do you think about this? Does this make sense to you? And it's been a really good regimen to go through the strategy.
How did you find those non-execs? How did you
they're all angel investors, or we brought them on and invited them to join the board. So.
Right.
But all people that we had done business with and enjoyed working with. So
to that point, and you brought it up in your session before this, regardless of the size of your company, an advisory board can be very relevant. I think the smaller your company, it can be exceptionally relevant. Oftentimes there's one shareholder, and an advisory board of 1 isn't very effective. So actually, most recently in 2014, BDC conducted a study of the correlation between businesses being successful and having advisory boards in place. And our survey base is really, small to medium-sized enterprise. We're not talking about large companies with big boards of directors. And there's a quantitative correlation between companies that have higher sales, higher revenue, higher profitability, and more productivity with companies that have advisory boards in place.
Really? That's very interesting.
And the study is actually available on our website. You can find it in the About Us section.
What's it called? Did you remember? We'll find it.
Pardon me?
It's in the about. It's in the about because that sounds like
it's escaping me now. It's
yeah. But that's a very
advisory boards is in the title.
Right.
It's a really good study. The succinct version is available for public consumption, but it's very relevant. And we have conversations even with our smallest clients saying, okay, well, do you have a mentor? Even if you want to talk to somebody at BDC, we advise on a whole different variety of topics for small businesses. Lean on your accountant, and putting in place a good accountant, I think, is essential regardless of your size. And in media and entertainment, there are people who specialize in that, from boutique firms all the way up to the big firms. So you're in a very lucky position that there's professionals out there that understand your industry and have in-depth knowledge.
For us, an advisory board has always been an ad hoc thing where we call up sort of people who have inadvertently advised us over the years. And we've
unpaid, I'm sure.
Unpaid advisory board, but definitely that would be, and growth for us is a very careful consideration.
Yes.
I think we spent an hour last night deciding whether we'd move into a slightly bigger office space. But we did hire a head of production and head of development this year, which is a big move for us.
We funded that through internal resources.
We funded that through internal resources, and that's been tremendous. And I think that is going to help us in the next several years. I know it's already helping us, but it's going to help us in the next several years and be able to increase our volume of development as well as our volume of production. But I'm still getting hung up on Jane saying that she'd fund my retirement. So, can I go now?
You said you didn't want to retire.
Well, no, I'm changing my mind now. if you're going to fund it,
I'll meet with your partner.
Right.
But so you've funded that expansion through your own resources. But Jane, I would imagine if a company like Amaze had a plan for growth that involved a need for working capital to hire people to generate more revenues or whatever it may be, and if they came to you and said, okay, we need X amount of money to do this, and we'll put up a quarter of it, a half of it, we want you to do. I imagine that's going to be a pretty potent, interesting
Absolutely.
proposition.
That's exactly the type of projects that we look at. There needs to be a substantiated reason why you're doing it. It has to be part of a strategy. But
not a yacht in Florida.
No, I was just going to say it can't be a trip to Vegas. But
unless it's to the licensing show.
Right. So actually, in that particular case, yes, we would fund that. But yeah, those are absolutely the types of interventions that we're making with companies in this space.
I wanted to ask you about diversification of your activities. You've talked about moving into the sales space or the exploitation space very early on. Shaftesbury, you've done the same. Has Amaze done that? Are you distributing some of your own content yet?
No, we're not. We have a first look deal with E1, and actually E1 was an initial investor in our company that gave us some seed money. Right. It was actually through Oasis International prior to Oasis being bought by E1. Right. But we have a strong relationship with E1 as a distribution partner, but that's a first look deal on our current series. Nelvana is distributing it internationally. So we maintain relationships with international distributors, but we have a long-standing one with E1.
I'm sort of leading to a question which is about, in Canada, opportunities for diversification for companies like these that might not be available right now, but you anticipate could be interesting in the future. What areas might you be looking at, each of you?
We've bought everybody we want, right?
I don't know if I can comment on that. Well, look, I think that the most exciting and interesting area has really been in the proliferation of SVOD and AVOD services, not just in Canada, but in Canada more recently, but around the globe. And I think for content creators and owners of content, I mean, we call it the democratization of distribution, right? And I think for us that's been a very interesting and growing area, both in terms of monetizing our current library of content, but what we will make in the future and how we will make it. No longer thinking strictly in terms of whatever 11 or 22-minute episodes. I think while Netflix and Hulu and Amazon and others have been great new businesses to sell into, YouTube has been really the surprise for us, where our catalog is getting something like 300 million views a month, and it's, I think it gross dollar terms, I believe it's a matter of public records, about $1 million a month, and that's a business that we didn't have a year and a half ago.
Right.
And I think for us to now come up with new ways to create and distribute content on that platform or those kinds of platforms, I really think that's one of the most interesting and exciting parts of the business right now.
Impressive. Anybody else have any views on this?
I think, I mean, we're, when we can find time in the day, we talk about sort of diversifying into YouTube channels, and actually are working with Shaftesbury on a very niche market YouTube channel that's targeted as a specific market. But for, again, it's like finding the time in the day to do that.
Well, that's an interesting point, because for companies that really desire and intend to grow, management time is a major constraint. So the idea for a company like you've described, you are having the time of the day, there may be an opportunity to bring in those sort of strategic skills that where you stay doing what you're doing and expand that and bring someone in to kind of run the business, or be more about holding the strategic ring on that. Would that
or partnering with companies that have more experience in that world than we do, as a way to kind of experiment and growth. And I guess the other thing that we're kind of looking at is we've always seen ourselves as a creative incubator, because we came from the creative. So the digital world is a way for us to, and that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this slightly bigger office, is so that we can have an edit suite to work with younger talent that is coming up through the ranks, which I know everyone's doing, but that's a new sort of arena for us to explore.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question and then throw it out. And I'm not sure, do we have a mic in the room at all? If not, then yes, we do.
Jonathan, can I just add on the strategy? I do think that it's important for companies of any size to actually carve out time to think about strategy. And it's the hardest thing to do when everybody is really so busy with their day in, day out jobs. And it's no different at our company. And what we've had to do is actually carve out a couple of days and go away.
Leave your office.
We'd go to Vegas if we could get a loan.
For like 2 weeks, right? At least. Well, as we said in the workshop we did before, we did like a mini version of that kind of that sort of away day, as we call it.
We do the same thing. We have little retreats, or we try to have a senior management, and it's really sharing market intelligence that we might not see each other during the day or the week, and so we sit down and we talk about trends and what's happening and what are the opportunities. And there's so many opportunities out there now. And if you don't focus on them, you're sort of. Why didn't I think of that?
That point about finding the space is relevant regardless of the size of the company.
Exactly.
It can be the smallest or the biggest or whatever it may be. Okay, my final question for each of you is having been involved in growth, financing growth, what's like the biggest pitfall along the route that you could advise people to watch out for?
Well, I think you really have to focus on your core business. What is it you want to do? And if you get too diverse and you lose your way on what your focus is, what you want to be, it can be quite distracting, and you may not create the content. If you want to be a content creator, or you want to be a sales agent, if you want to be everything but you're not doing any of them really well, it's probably a problem. So really make sure that your core what you really want to be when you grow up.
Right.
It's focused on.
Know what that is and keep that as...
And make sure it's primary.
Yeah, okay.
I would say that sometimes companies don't understand what growth is going to cost them financially.
Right.
And really lose sight of that when you're growing your top line, it's going to affect the in-between that affects your bottom line. So you want to manage that appropriately, and not grow too quickly. So I like that you're nice and patient, because sometimes entrepreneurs are passionate people. They get excited about an idea and they want to go pursue it, but don't really understand the implications to the core business if it's not part of a long-term vision for the company. So really understanding where you are and where you want to be and how that affects your existing business, I would say, are really the key points.
That's great advice. Stephen?
I was going to say focus, but Scott took that. So I think what I would say is really understand your own skill set and make sure that you don't try and do the things that you're not very good at, and understand what those are too. Get other people around you who do those things better.
Okay.
And exactly what Jane said is not too big, too fast.
Right.
I mean, we certainly haven't gone that route, but
Right.
we've seen others in the industry that have sort of
Crashed and
expanded
burned.
too quickly, and then couldn't support that. So we're very cautious in terms of expansion.
Great, thank you. Right, so show of hands, please, for someone who's got a question. And is that microphone around anywhere? Okay.
We answered all of them.
Usually if I keep quiet, eventually somebody will say. Yes.
Steve,
Can you just wait for the mic? Sorry.
About this new space.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm just curious, I'm
my
Teza, I'm
personal
Mike's
partner.
business partner, but I'm curious, Steve, if you could talk about maybe your mentor, maybe who brought you in and who guided you?
I had a number of different mentors, but
Leslie Nielsen.
Leslie Nielsen, no. Good answer, though. But I did start working at Alliance at a very early stage in that company when there were maybe 20 people. And there were two people there, one of them Robert Lantos and the other one John Kemeny, both of whom were really interesting, great people to work with for many years.
Scott, maybe we can ask, I'm just curious.
No, I think working with Christina has been a fabulous experience. And one of the things we haven't talked about is to do what we do in this environment, which is ever changing. You need to be perseverance. You need to be nimble. You get good news and you get bad news. So it's staying the course, but being able to take bad news and then. So we had a situation where Murdoch, which is now 9 seasons, which started at one broadcaster, they pulled the license just before a deadline. We managed to flip it over to Chum, who picked it up, and we did a series of movies. Chum then got bought by Bell, and they, poor little Murdoch got sent over to the city. So then we thought, okay, we're dead now. But we said, okay, we'll keep on going. And then City, we had a really nice run with them, 5 years, and they decided that they wanted to move on. And then we said, okay, let's find a new home. And they're saying, well, you don't need a new home, it's done. And we said, no, we think there's still life in this franchise. And so we then went out and we found a home at CBC. So, no, it is really a struggle sometimes, and it's perseverance, but it's also a fantastic job. So I think it's not losing sight about how much fun we can have in what we do, and thinking outside the box, finding new ways to do new business models, new ways to become sustainable, and not just saying, okay, this is the way it's always been done.
So it's a constant challenge to think and analyze where you are and where you're going to go, and is it the same place you thought you were going to go?
Well, the whole idea of doing a business plan that's 3 years down the road now, I find mind-boggling.
Right.
I sort of think, okay, what's going to happen in 6 months? So.
Right. Any more questions? Okay, I'm going to ask another question, which is about whether you've spotted any international companies, non-Canadian companies, that are, might be similar in size to any one of you, perhaps a bit smaller than DJ. But whether you've spotted any examples of successful corporate growth strategies in companies outside Canada that you think, that's an interesting way of growing their business?
Well, you what was the word you used? The super micro.
Right.
Yes. And of course, there's this other word that I only ever heard used in England is the super indie.
The super indie, yes.
And I think it's been very interesting just to watch those various companies grow, most entirely by acquisition and generally buying small creative companies and leaving them intact.
Right.
And Zodiac has done that. All Three Media has done that.
Sure.
There's a number of other companies that have done that, and it's been interesting to watch. I think that from our point of view, it's very different from what we've done because we tend to buy and consolidate. And I'm very curious just in terms of management, how tricky it is to manage all of those little companies that presumably in some territories are competing with one another for commissions.
Yeah. Well, from what I know about those companies, and we deal with a few of them, when those acquisitions are being made, obviously we know why in the UK it became very fashionable and interesting to do it because of terms of trade changed and the ability of these small independent companies to hang on to their assets. It was transformed overnight in 2003 with our Communications Act. But when the acquisitions were taking place, there was always the issue of, well, do we need to do anything with this business in order to make it better than what it is, even though we're buying it and we like it as it is? And in some cases, acquirers decided, yes, we need to change, and we need to take this person out and put our person in. And I would say, by and large, that has not worked particularly well. But the situations like with Darlow Smithson, for example, where they sort of said, you know what, it ain't broke, we're not going to fix it, stick to the knitting, and that has gone on and been very, very successful. By the way, one of the things that happened as a result of that whole British change in the terms of trade and this super indie thing was that the actual quality of the content improved dramatically because the producers were much more motivated in making content that worked internationally and globally because they got a big piece of it. And so even though the broadcasters were very resistant to the change to begin with, because it meant they had less, they owned less, actually even though they owned less of the content was better, delivering better audiences domestically and earning more internationally. So it was a win-win. And of course in Canada, I guess you're not at that situation quite in terms of trade. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of our allotted slot with about a minute to go. So what I want to do is... Okay. I thought you were going to give us your sustainability of a production association speech.
Somebody wrote me a pretty good report, Jonathan.
Oh, yes, I'll get you a copy. So thank you very much, all of you, for sitting so patiently and listening. I'm sorry that this wonderful sun we've had here has been blinding about half of the group, but I've been able to see you, even though you couldn't be able to see us. But most importantly, I really want to thank, on behalf of all of us, the very generous willingness of all of our panelists to be very open about what's on their mind and what's in their business, and perhaps you'd like to join me in expressing our appreciation. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you indeed. Thank you, everyone. So if everyone would kindly return to the main ballroom for the final session of the day, a fireside chat with David Brown, who's Head of Partnerships at YouTube Canada, and Val Creighton, President and CEO of the CMF. See you there.